Bear cub sinking into a play zone ball pit. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the windows of Rainbow Kids Play Center as 23-year-old Zara Thompson pushed through the glass doors. Her 18-month-old daughter, Ruby, balanced on her hip. The familiar chaos of children's laughter and bouncing balls filled the air. But something felt different today. The usual energy seemed more electric, more alive. Ruby's tiny fingers clutched her favorite stuffed elephant while her wide brown eyes took in the colorful wonderland before them. Plastic slides twisted in bright spirals, climbing walls beckoned with rainbow handholds, and in the center of it all sat the massive ball pit. Thousands of multicolored plastic spheres, creating a sea of joy that had captivated children for years. "Look at all those balls, baby girl," Zara whispered, pointing toward the pit where several older kids were already diving and laughing. Ruby giggled, her chubby hands reaching toward the distant colors. What neither Zara nor anyone else in the play center knew was that less than a mile away, through the dense woods that bordered the facility, a desperate mother bear was frantically searching for her missing cub. The same cub that had wandered too far from their den in the early morning hours, following the sweet scent of something unfamiliar. As Zara set Ruby down near the toddler area, the 18-month-old immediately began her unsteady journey toward the ball pit, her elephant dragging behind her. Other parents chatted nearby, their attention divided between coffee cups and casual conversation, completely unaware that their peaceful Saturday morning was about to change forever. The first sign that something was wrong came not from inside the play center, but from the loading dock behind the building. Kitchen staff member Marcus Reed was unloading a delivery truck when he heard rustling in the nearby bushes. He paused, listening carefully, but dismissed it as probably just a stray cat or raccoon. Inside, Ruby had reached the edge of the ball pit, her small hands gripping the padded border as she watched older children dive beneath the colorful surface. 7-year-old twins, Kai and Maya Chen, were having a competition to see who could stay buried under the balls the longest, while 10-year-old Brooklyn Martinez cheered them on from the edge. "Be careful in there," called their mother, Elena Chen, though her voice carried more amusement than concern. The ball pit had always been safe. What could possibly go wrong in a sea of soft plastic spheres? Ruby babbled excitedly, bouncing on her toes as she watched the bigger kids play. Her elephant had been forgotten on the floor behind her, as all her attention focused on the mesmerizing movement of the balls. Something about the way they shifted and swirled captivated her young mind in a way that nothing else ever had. That's when the first scream pierced the air. But it wasn't human. The sound came from somewhere near the back of the building, a high-pitched cry of distress that made every parent in the play center freeze mid-conversation. Marcus Reed, still at the loading dock, felt his blood run cold as he recognized the sound for what it was, an animal in trouble. "Did you hear that?" Elena Chen asked, looking around nervously. Before anyone could answer, a small brown blur crashed through the emergency exit door that Marcus had propped open while unloading. The bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, tumbled across the padded play area floor, its fur matted with morning dew and its dark eyes wide with terror. Children screamed, parents gasped, and in the chaos that followed, nobody noticed the cub's desperate scramble toward what looked like safety, the soft, colorful ball pit where it could hide from all the frightening human sounds. The cub dove headfirst into the balls, disappearing beneath the surface just as Ruby, startled by the commotion, lost her balance and tumbled forward into the pit herself. Now, two innocent creatures were sinking beneath thousands of plastic spheres, and the real story was just beginning. For a moment that felt like eternity, complete silence fell over the play center. Parents stood frozen, their coffee cups halfway to their lips, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The older children who had been playing in the ball pit scrambled to the edges, their laughter replaced by confused whispers. "Where did they go?" Brooklyn Martinez asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she peered into the colorful sea, where both the baby and the cub had disappeared. Zara Thompson felt her heart stop. 1 second, her precious Ruby had been standing at the edge of the pit, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the same ocean of plastic that had claimed the mysterious animal. Her maternal instincts kicked in like lightning, and she rushed toward the pit, pushing aside chairs and climbing structures in her way. "Ruby, Ruby, baby, where are you?" she called out, her voice cracking with panic. But beneath the surface of the ball pit, something extraordinary was happening. Ruby, instead of crying or panicking as any 18-month-old might, found herself face to face with the frightened bear cub. The little creature was no bigger than her stuffed animals at home, with soft brown fur and dark eyes that reflected the same confusion she felt. The cub was struggling, its small paws paddling frantically through the balls, unable to find solid ground. The plastic spheres kept shifting beneath its weight, creating a quicksand effect that pulled it deeper with every movement. Ruby, with the instinctive curiosity of a toddler, reached out her tiny hand and touched the cub's wet nose. The touch seemed to calm them both. Above them, chaos was erupting. Elena Chen had called 911, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the impossible situation to the dispatcher. "Yes, there's a bear cub in our children's play center, and now there's a baby in the ball pit with it." "No, I'm not joking." Marcus Reed burst through the main entrance, having abandoned his delivery truck. "The mother bear," he shouted to anyone who would listen. "She's outside. She's looking for her baby." As if summoned by his words, a deep, rumbling growl echoed from somewhere near the building's entrance. Through the glass doors, the silhouette of a massive black bear could be seen pacing back and forth, her nose pressed to the glass, her massive paws leaving prints on the surface. "Everyone stay calm," called out Play Center manager Diana Walsh, though her own voice betrayed her terror. She had worked here for 8 years and had dealt with birthday party meltdowns, scraped knees, and lost toys, but never anything like this. Nobody moved toward the doors. But the real drama was still unfolding beneath the balls. Ruby had somehow managed to wrap her small arms around the struggling cub, and in a moment that defied all logic, the frightened animal stopped fighting. Instead, it pressed its small body against the warmth of the human baby, finding comfort in her innocent presence. The balls around them shifted and swirled, but instead of sinking deeper, they seemed to find a pocket of stability. Ruby giggled softly, the sound muffled by the plastic spheres, and began patting the cub's head the same way she petted her stuffed animals at home. "I can see movement," Kai Chen shouted from the edge of the pit. "They're over there, near the middle." Zara didn't hesitate. Ignoring the gasps and protests from other parents, she climbed into the ball pit herself, wading through the plastic sea toward where her daughter had last been seen. Each step was like walking through thick mud, the balls giving way beneath her feet only to close in around her legs. "Ruby, baby, Mommy's coming," she called, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Behind her, Diana Walsh was on her radio, trying to coordinate with authorities while keeping one eye on the growing shadow at the front doors. The mother bear was getting more agitated, her pacing becoming more frantic as her cub's scent grew stronger. "How long does it take for animal control to get here?" Elena Chen asked, clutching her twins close to her chest. "They said 15 minutes," Diana replied, but they all knew that 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours when a protective mother bear was involved. That's when they heard it. A sound that made everyone's blood run cold. It wasn't the growl of the mother bear outside, or the muffled voices from the ball pit. It was the distinct sound of glass beginning to crack. The mother bear had found a weak spot in the door. "She's breaking in," Marco shouted, backing away from the entrance. "Everyone needs to get to the back of the building now." But Zara couldn't leave, not when Ruby was somewhere in that ball pit with a wild animal. She continued, pushing through the plastic spheres, following the sound of her daughter's soft babbling, which had somehow remained calm and happy despite the chaos around them. What she found when she finally reached them would stay with her for the rest of her life. Ruby was sitting in a small clearing among the balls, the bear cub curled up in her lap like a sleepy puppy. The baby was humming a wordless tune, the same melody Zara sang to her every night at bedtime, while gently stroking the cub's fur. The wild animal, which should have been dangerous and unpredictable, was completely relaxed, its eyes closed in what looked almost like contentment. "Oh my God," Zara whispered, not daring to move closer for fear of breaking the magical spell that seemed to have fallen over the unlikely pair. The crack of splintering glass echoed through the building, followed by the heavy thud of paws on the play-center floor. The mother bear had found her way inside, and her massive form cast long shadows across the colorful playground equipment. Parents screamed and gathered their children, pushing toward the back exits, but the bear showed no interest in them. Her attention was focused entirely on the ball pit, where the scent of her cub was strongest. She approached slowly, her massive head swaying back and forth as she tried to locate her baby. Ruby looked up at the sound of the approaching footsteps and saw the enormous bear towering over the edge of the pit. Instead of crying or showing fear, she smiled her biggest, toothless grin and waved her tiny hand, as if greeting an old friend. "Hi," she said in her sweet baby voice, the word clear and unmistakable. The mother bear stopped dead in her tracks, her fierce expression softening as she looked down at the tiny human holding her precious cub. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended species, language, and all the barriers that usually separated the wild from the civilized world. The cub stirred in Ruby's arms, lifting its head to see its mother. Instead of scrambling to escape, it remained calm, seeming to sense that the baby who had comforted it was not a threat, but a friend. Zara held her breath, knowing that one wrong move could turn this magical moment into a tragedy. The mother bear could easily reach into the pit and take both her cub and Ruby, but instead she simply watched, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene before her. That's when Ruby did something that would become the most talked-about moment in the play center's history. She carefully lifted the bear cub, struggling with its weight but determined to help, and held it up toward its mother. "Mama," she said, the word filled with an understanding far beyond her 18 months of life. The mother bear's response was unlike anything the terrified onlookers had ever witnessed. Instead of roaring or charging, she made a soft chuffing sound, almost like a sigh of relief. She gently reached down with one massive paw and carefully, incredibly gently, lifted her cub from Ruby's arms. But the story was far from over. As the mother bear cradled her baby, she did something that made everyone in the building gasp in wonder. She reached down again, this time for Ruby, and with the same incredible gentleness, lifted the human baby from the ball pit and placed her safely on the padded floor beside Zara. Ruby clapped her hands in delight, as if she had just finished the most wonderful game in the world. The bear cub looked back at her from its mother's arms, and if animals could smile, everyone would have sworn that's exactly what it was doing. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of sirens growing closer. Animal control, police, and paramedics were finally arriving, but they would find a situation unlike anything they had been prepared for. Marcus Reed, who had been recording the entire encounter on his phone, lowered the device with shaking hands. "Did that really just happen?" he whispered. But as the mother bear began to move toward the broken entrance, carrying her cub to safety, Ruby suddenly started to cry. Not the frightened wail of a traumatized child, but the heartbroken sobs of someone saying goodbye to a friend. The mother bear stopped, looking back at the crying baby. For a moment it seemed like she might return, but the sound of approaching vehicles made her decision for her. With one last look at Ruby, she disappeared through the shattered doorway and back into the woods from which she had come. The play center fell into stunned silence, broken only by Ruby's continued crying and the growing sound of sirens outside. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, as they all tried to process what they had just witnessed. But in the days that would follow, as news of the incredible encounter spread around the world, one question would haunt everyone who had been there. How had an 18-month-old baby managed to create a bond with a wild bear cub that even experienced animal handlers might have struggled to achieve? The answer, they would discover, was more mysterious and wonderful than anyone could have imagined. The first responders arrived to find a scene that challenged everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. Officer Jennifer Morales stepped through the shattered glass doorway, her hand resting on her radio, expecting to find injured children and a dangerous wild animal situation. Instead, she found a group of parents and children sitting quietly, many of them wiping tears from their eyes, all staring at an 18-month-old baby who was still sobbing softly in her mother's arms. "Where's the bear?" Officer Morales asked, looking around the colorful play area with confusion. "Gone," Diana Walsh replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're both gone. Back to the woods." Animal Control Officer Rick Santos pushed past the broken door frame, carrying a tranquilizer gun and wearing thick protective gear. He had responded to dozens of wild animal calls over his 15-year career, but he had never seen a group of people look so peaceful after such an encounter. "Anyone injured?" he called out, scanning the room for signs of the chaos he had expected. Zara looked down at Ruby, who had finally stopped crying, but was now making soft whimpering sounds, reaching her little arms toward the broken doorway where the bears had disappeared. "She's not hurt," Zara said slowly, "but something's wrong. She won't stop trying to go after them." Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the paramedic who had rushed in behind the officers, knelt beside Ruby and began her standard examination. The baby's vital signs were perfect. No scratches, no bruises, no signs of trauma. But as Dr. Rodriguez checked Ruby's responses, she noticed something unusual. "Has she always been this aware?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, watching as Ruby's eyes followed every movement, every sound, with an intensity that seemed far beyond her age. "What do you mean?" Zara asked, though even as she said it, she realized she had been wondering the same thing. Ruby had always been a bright child, but today she had acted with a wisdom and calmness that seemed impossible for someone who had just learned to walk. Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, Marcus Reed approached them, his phone still clutched in his trembling hands. "I got it all on video," he said, his voice filled with awe, every single second. The way that baby looked at the bear, the way she held the cub, it was like she was talking to them. "Talking to them?" Officer Morales raised an eyebrow. "She's 18 months old." "Not with words," Marcus insisted, pulling up the video on his phone. "But look at this, really look." The group gathered around the small screen as Marcus played back the footage. There, captured in stunning clarity, was the moment when Ruby first touched the bear cub's nose. But what made everyone gasp was what they could see now that they hadn't noticed in the chaos of the moment. Ruby's expression changed the instant she made contact with the cub. Her usual baby babbling stopped, replaced by soft rhythmic sounds that seemed almost like communication. The cub's response was immediate and clear. Its panicked struggling ceased, and it moved closer to the human baby as if drawn by an invisible force. "Play it again, Doctor," Rodriguez requested, her medical training kicking in as she studied Ruby's behavior on the screen. This time, they all noticed the way Ruby's eyes seemed to focus with laser-like intensity on the cub, how her tiny hands moved in gentle, purposeful gestures, and most remarkably, how she seemed to anticipate the cub's needs before it even expressed them. "That's impossible," Elena Chen whispered, having joined the group around the phone. "Babies that age don't have that kind of understanding." But as they continued watching, the evidence became undeniable. When the mother bear appeared, Ruby hadn't shown fear. She had shown recognition, as if she had been expecting the massive animal all along. And when she lifted the cub toward its mother, her movements were deliberate and confident, not the random actions of a confused toddler. "There's something else," Marcus said, scrolling through his phone to another video. "I started recording when I first heard the commotion outside. Look at what happened before the cub even entered the building." The new video showed Ruby at the edge of the ball pit, but instead of watching the other children play, she was staring toward the back of the building with an expression of intense concentration. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. "She knew," Zara breathed, realization dawning on her face. "She knew they were coming before any of us did." Dr. Rodriguez stood up slowly, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed to belong more in science fiction than in medical reality. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you some questions about Ruby's development. Has she ever shown unusual sensitivities to animals before?" "What kind of sensitivities?" Zara asked, though even as she formed the question, memories began flooding back. Ruby's fascination with the neighbor's cat, how dogs in the park always seemed drawn to her, the way she would sometimes wake up at night and point toward the window, as if she sensed something moving in the darkness outside. "Birds," Zara said suddenly, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. "Last month, she spent an entire afternoon sitting by our back door, just staring at the sky. I thought she was watching clouds, but then this huge flock of geese flew over our house. She started making these sounds, almost like she was calling to them." Officer Morales exchanged glances with Rick Santos. In all their years of experience, they had heard stories of people who seemed to have unusual connections with animals, but they had always dismissed them as folklore or exaggeration. "There's more," Zara continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories came flooding back. "Our pediatrician, Dr. Williams, he mentioned something at her last checkup. He said her brain activity was unusual, not abnormal, just different. More active in certain areas than he typically sees in children her age." Dr. Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. She had heard of rare cases, documented in medical journals but rarely taken seriously by mainstream medicine, of individuals who seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of animal behavior and communication. The scientific community called it interspecies empathic connection, though most doctors preferred to attribute such phenomena to coincidence or wishful thinking. "We need to document this properly," Dr. Rodriguez said, pulling out her own phone to take notes. "What happened here today, it's not just unusual, it's unprecedented. That baby didn't just calm a wild animal. She formed a genuine bond with it in a matter of minutes." Ruby, who had been quietly observing the adults talking around her, suddenly perked up and pointed toward the broken doorway. Everyone turned to look, but the entrance appeared empty. "What is it, baby girl?" Zara asked softly. Ruby made a series of soft sounds, different from her usual babbling. They were rhythmic, almost musical, and they seemed to carry meaning even though no one could understand what that meaning might be. That's when they heard it. A distant sound from the woods beyond the play center. It was the same chuffing noise the mother bear had made before leaving, but fainter, as if it was coming from far away. Ruby clapped her hands in delight and made the musical sounds again, and incredibly another distant chuff echoed back from the forest. "They're communicating," Marcus whispered, his phone camera capturing every moment. "That baby is actually communicating with wild bears." Officer Morales keyed her radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Morales at the Rainbow Kids incident. I need to speak with someone from the State Wildlife Department immediately. We have a situation that's going to require some specialized expertise." As the adults continued to process what they had witnessed, Ruby began to grow restless in her mother's arms. She kept pointing toward different areas of the play center, making her musical sounds, and each time she did, faint responses seemed to come from outside. Not just from the direction the bears had gone, but from multiple locations around the building. Dr. Rodriguez grabbed Zara's arm gently. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't think the bears were the only animals drawn here today. I think your daughter might be calling to them." As if to confirm her suspicions, a soft scratching sound came from near the kitchen area, then another from the storage room, and another from somewhere near the climbing wall. Diana Walsh, who had been quiet since the initial chaos, suddenly went pale. "The loading dock," she whispered. Marcus left the back door propped open when he ran inside. If other animals heard, whatever it is she's doing. The group fell silent, listening carefully. The scratching sounds were getting louder, and they were coming from multiple directions now. Ruby seemed delighted by this development, clapping her hands and making even more of her musical sounds. "We need to evacuate," Officer Morales said, reaching for her radio again. "Now!" But before anyone could move, a small brown shape darted across the far end of the play area, then another and another. "Raccoons," Rick Santos identified, raising his tranquilizer gun. 3 of them, maybe 4. But Ruby's reaction to seeing the raccoons was the same as it had been to the bears. She reached toward them, making her soft musical sounds, and the raccoons stopped their nervous scurrying and turned to look at her with what could only be described as curiosity. "This is impossible, Doctor," Rodriguez muttered, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing with her own eyes. The largest raccoon, a female with distinctive markings around her eyes, began to approach slowly. She moved with none of the skittish caution typical of wild raccoons, instead walking directly toward Ruby with the same trust that the bear cub had shown. "Nobody move," Rick Santos warned, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. What he was witnessing challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. Ruby wiggled in her mother's arms, clearly wanting to get down and greet the approaching raccoon. Zara held her tighter, torn between protecting her daughter and the growing realization that Ruby might be safer with these wild animals than she was being kept away from them. The raccoon stopped just a few feet away from them, sitting back on her haunches in an almost human-like posture. She tilted her head and made a soft, chittering sound. Ruby responded immediately with her musical babbling, and the raccoon chittered back. They continued this back-and-forth exchange for several minutes, watched by a room full of adults who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something that would change everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and the natural world. "She's not just talking to them," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder as he continued recording. They're having actual conversations. That's when the first bird landed on the windowsill. Then a second. Within minutes, the windows were lined with dozens of different species. Cardinals, blue jays, robins, even a magnificent red-tailed hawk that normally would have scattered all the smaller birds. Ruby saw them, and her excitement was palpable. She made a series of different sounds, each one seeming to be directed at different types of birds, and each species responded with their own calls. Dr. Rodriguez was frantically taking notes, trying to document what was happening, but she knew that no one who hadn't been there would ever believe it. "This isn't just unusual animal behavior," she said to no one in particular. "This is the discovery of a completely new form of human-animal communication." But as amazing as the display was, it was also becoming dangerous. More animals were arriving by the minute, drawn by whatever signal Ruby was sending out. Through the broken doorway, they could see shapes moving in the woods, more bears, deer, even what looked like a family of foxes. "We can't stay here," Officer Morales said, but her voice was uncertain. "But I don't know how we get out safely with all these animals gathering outside." Ruby, as if sensing the adult's concern, suddenly went quiet. She looked around at all the animals that had come in response to her calls, then back at the worried faces of the humans surrounding her. For a moment, her baby features seemed to carry the weight of understanding far beyond her years. Then she made one final, long musical sound that seemed to carry both gratitude and farewell. The response was immediate and astounding. The raccoons chittered softly and began filing back toward the kitchen area. The birds on the windowsills took flight, not in panic but in an organized departure that looked almost ceremonial. Even the shapes in the woods began to retreat deeper into the forest. Within 5 minutes, all the animals were gone, except for the lingering scent of the wild and the soft sounds of the forest returning to its normal rhythm. Ruby looked up at her mother and smiled, then said one clear word that made everyone in the room gasp: "Home." It was the first real word she had ever spoken, and somehow everyone knew that she wasn't talking about going back to the house where she lived with Zara. She was talking about something much bigger, much more profound, a home that included not just humans, but every living creature that shared the world around them. As the state wildlife officials arrived and began their investigation, as reporters started gathering outside and scientists began making phone calls, one thing became clear to everyone who had witnessed the events at Rainbow Kids Play Center. Ruby Thompson wasn't just a special baby who had an unusual gift with animals. She was something entirely new, a bridge between two worlds that had been separate for far too long. And her story was just beginning. Within hours of Marcus Reed's video hitting social media, the world had turned its attention to the small town of Millbrook and its most extraordinary resident. The footage, which Marcus had titled "Baby Talks to Wild Bears, You Won't Believe What Happens Next," had been viewed over 2 million times before the sun set on that remarkable Saturday. But fame, Zara Thompson was quickly learning, came with a price she hadn't expected to pay. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the National Institute of Animal Behavior," the voice on the phone said for the 3rd time that evening. "I really need to speak with you about your daughter's remarkable abilities. We believe she may be the key to understanding interspecies communication in ways we never thought possible." Zara hung up, just as she had hung up on the previous 12 calls from researchers, reporters, and what she was beginning to suspect were government officials who wouldn't identify themselves properly. Ruby was asleep in her arms, finally peaceful after a day that had changed both their lives forever. And Zara wasn't about to wake her for anyone. But peace, it seemed, was no longer an option for the Thompson family. The first sign of how drastically their world had changed came at 6:30 a.m. Sunday morning, when Zara opened her front door to get the newspaper and found her small front yard filled with news vans, reporters, and crowds of curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as soon as she appeared, and a dozen voices began shouting questions at once. "Mrs. Thompson, is it true your daughter can speak with animals? What was going through your mind when you saw the bear with your baby? Has Ruby shown these abilities before?" Zara slammed the door shut, her heart pounding. Ruby stirred in her crib, making soft sounds that Zara was now hearing with completely different ears. Were those just normal baby sounds, or was Ruby responding to something Zara couldn't perceive? The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number she recognized: Dr. Williams, Ruby's pediatrician. "Zara, thank God you answered," Dr. Williams said, his usually calm voice filled with urgency. "I've been trying to reach you all night. We need to talk, and I mean immediately. There are things about Ruby's medical history that I should have paid more attention to before now." "What kind of things?" Zara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Can you come in this morning?" "Early, before my regular appointments start?" "And Zara, bring Ruby. I need to run some tests that I should have run months ago." After hanging up, Zara looked out her living room window at the crowd that seemed to be growing by the minute. How was she supposed to get to Dr. Williams' office through that mob? And more importantly, what tests was he talking about? The answer came from an unexpected source. Her doorbell rang, and when she peered through the peephole, she saw Diana Walsh from the Play Center, accompanied by a woman in a dark suit who looked distinctly official. "Zara, it's Diana," came the muffled voice through the door. "This is Agent Sarah Chen from the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. She has some information you need to hear, and she can help you get out of here safely." Against her better judgment, Zara opened the door just wide enough to let them slip inside, quickly closing it again before the reporters could surge forward. Agent Chen was a petite woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and a serious expression. She pulled out her credentials and handed them to Zara for inspection. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you because time is of the essence. Your daughter's abilities have attracted attention from some very powerful people, and not all of them have her best interests at heart." "What do you mean?" Zara asked, instinctively holding Ruby closer. "There are private research facilities that would pay millions to study a child like Ruby," Agent Chen explained. "There are government programs that have been looking for someone with her abilities for decades, and there are people who would exploit her gift for profit in ways you can't imagine." Diana Walsh nodded grimly. "Zara, 3 different people have already approached me about buying the Play Center just so they could turn it into some kind of research facility. The offers were substantial." Agent Chen continued, "What happened yesterday isn't just a feel-good story about a baby and some bears. Ruby has demonstrated abilities that could revolutionize our understanding of animal behavior, conservation efforts, even climate change research. She could be used to prevent human-wildlife conflicts, to understand migration patterns, to communicate with endangered species. Or she could be turned into a laboratory specimen," Zara said quietly, the implications finally sinking in. "Exactly. That's why I'm here. The Department of Wildlife and Fisheries has a program designed to protect individuals with unique environmental sensitivities. We can provide security, privacy, and most importantly, we can ensure that Ruby's abilities are studied in a way that respects her humanity and her childhood." Ruby chose that moment to wake up, looking around at the 3 women with her usual bright curiosity. But as Agent Chen spoke, Ruby's expression changed. She stared at the agent with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Then Ruby began to cry. Not the normal fussing of a tired baby, but deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than her 18 months of life should have allowed her to access. "She knows," Diana whispered. "She understands what you're talking about." Agent Chen looked shaken. In all her years of government service, she had never seen a baby respond to a conversation with such clear comprehension. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to get you and Ruby somewhere safe while we figure out the best way to handle this situation. There are already unmarked cars parked 3 blocks away, and I don't think they're reporters." The sound of Ruby's crying seemed to trigger something outside. Through the windows, they could see birds landing in unusual numbers on the surrounding trees. Dogs in the neighborhood began barking, not the aggressive barking of territorial animals, but the worried whining of creatures responding to distress. "It's happening again," Zara said, recognizing the pattern from the day before. "She's calling to them." Agent Chen pulled out her phone and made a quick call. "We need extraction now. The subject is active. Yes, I know what that means for the operation." Within minutes, the sound of helicopters could be heard approaching. But these weren't news helicopters. They were military aircraft, moving with purpose and precision that made Zara's blood run cold. "You called the military?" she demanded. "I called for protection," Agent Chen replied. "But it looks like someone else made the call first." Through the front window, they could see black SUVs pulling up behind the news vans. Men in dark suits were getting out, showing badges to the reporters and moving them back, with an authority that brooked no argument. Diana Walsh grabbed Zara's arm. "There's a back way out through my car. I parked in the alley behind your house. We can get you to Dr. Williams' office before any of these people figure out what's happening." But as they moved toward the back door, Ruby's crying intensified, and the response from the animals outside became more pronounced. The birds weren't just landing now. They were calling, creating a cacophony of sound that seemed to be building to something. "She's scared," Zara realized. "All of this attention, all these strangers, she's calling for help." That's when the first bear appeared at the edge of the yard. It wasn't the mother bear from the play center. This was a larger male, probably drawn by Ruby's distress calls from wherever he had been foraging in the nearby woods. He stood on his hind legs, sniffing the air and looking directly at the house where Ruby's cries were coming from. Agent Chen spoke rapidly into her radio. "We have a code red situation. Multiple animal responses to the subject. Request immediate backup and tranquilizer teams." "No," Zara said sharply. "You're not tranquilizing animals that are just responding to my daughter's distress. They're not attacking anyone. They're trying to help her." As if to prove her point, the bear dropped to all fours and began making the same gentle chuffing sounds they had heard from the mother bear the day before. Ruby's crying began to quiet slightly, and she reached her arms toward the window where she somehow sensed the bear was waiting. More animals were arriving. Deer emerging from the small patch of woods behind the neighborhood, raccoons appearing from storm drains, even domestic cats and dogs slipping away from their homes to gather in response to Ruby's call. Diana Walsh stared out the window in amazement. "It's like she's gathering an army." But Agent Chen's expression was grim. "That's exactly what the people in those black cars are going to think. Mrs. Thompson, we need to leave now, before this situation escalates beyond anyone's ability to control it." The sound of the helicopters was getting louder, and through the front windows they could see more official vehicles arriving. Whatever government department Agent Chen represented, it was clear that other agencies had their own interest in Ruby's abilities. "Dr. Williams," Zara said suddenly. "He said there were things about Ruby's medical history he should have paid attention to. What if this isn't as unprecedented as we think? What if there have been others?" Agent Chen's expression changed, becoming guarded. Mrs. Thompson, there are some things that are classified above my clearance level. But I will say this. The program I work for wasn't created yesterday, and Ruby isn't the first child we've been asked to protect. Diana Walsh looked between them. You mean there are other children with abilities like Ruby's? I mean that the intersection of human development and environmental sensitivity is something that certain government agencies have been studying for a very long time. Agent Chen replied carefully. And the results of those studies are why it's so important that we get Ruby to safety before the wrong people decide she's too valuable to remain with her mother. Ruby had stopped crying, but her distress seemed to have been replaced by something even more concerning, a focused determination that looked frightening on the face of such a young child. She was making her musical sounds again, but these were different from the ones she had used to communicate with the bears and other animals. These sounds were more complex, more urgent, and they seemed to be carrying much farther than should have been physically possible. Through the windows, they could see that the animals weren't just gathering anymore, they were organizing. The birds were arranging themselves in specific patterns on the trees and power lines. The mammals were positioning themselves at strategic points around the house. Even the insects seemed to be responding, with clouds of butterflies and dragonflies creating moving patterns in the air. She's not calling for help anymore, Zara realized with a mixture of pride and terror. She's giving them instructions. Agent Chen was speaking rapidly into her radio, but it was clear from her expression that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's contingency plans. All units be advised, do not attempt to approach the house until the animal response subsides. We have potential for mass wildlife incident. But it was already too late for careful approaches. The men from the black SUVs were moving toward the house with the confidence of people who were used to getting what they wanted, regardless of obstacles. They had tranquilizer guns and nets, and it was clear they intended to take Ruby with them, whether Zara consented or not. The lead man was halfway across the front yard when the bear stood up again and roared. It wasn't the gentle chuffing sound he had made before. This was a full-throated roar of warning that made every human in the area freeze in their tracks. The other animals responded immediately. The birds took flight in a coordinated pattern that blocked the view from the helicopters. The deer positioned themselves between the house and the approaching men, and even the domestic cats and dogs formed a protective barrier. Ruby clapped her hands in delight, apparently pleased with the response to her call. But Zara could see something in her daughter's eyes that terrified her more than all the government agents and wild animals combined. Ruby was learning. With each new situation, each new challenge, her abilities were growing stronger and more sophisticated. What had started as simple communication with a frightened bear cub was rapidly evolving into something that looked more like command and control. Agent Chen, Zara said quietly, I think we're past the point where you can protect my daughter from people who want to study her. I think we're at the point where people need to be protected from what my daughter is becoming. Agent Chen looked at Ruby, who was now making complex patterns of sounds, while watching the organized response of dozens of wild animals, and for the first time since arriving she looked truly afraid. Mrs. Thompson, she said slowly, I think you might be right, and I think we're all in much more danger than any of us realized. Outside, the standoff between the government agents and Ruby's impromptu army of wildlife was reaching a critical point. The helicopters were circling, but couldn't land safely with so many animals in the area. The men with tranquilizer guns were surrounded by creatures that showed no fear and seemed to be operating under some kind of unified command. And in the center of it all was an 18-month-old baby who had just spoken her second word, said so quietly that only her mother heard it. Mine. Ruby Thompson was claiming her territory, her family, and her right to exist free from those who would exploit her gift. And she had an army of every living creature within miles to back up that claim. The question was no longer whether Ruby had an unusual ability to communicate with animals. The question was whether she was still entirely human, or if she was evolving into something altogether new, something that might be humanity's greatest hope or its most formidable challenge. As the morning sun climbed higher and the standoff in the suburban yard continued, one thing became clear to everyone present. The world had changed forever the moment a tiny human hand touched a frightened bear cub's nose, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Government agents stood frozen as wild animals surrounded them in perfect formation. Helicopters circled overhead, unable to land. News crews broadcast live footage of what commentators were already calling the most extraordinary standoff in human history. But Ruby, sitting peacefully in her mother's arms, seemed oblivious to the chaos she had created. She was making soft musical sounds while watching a butterfly that had landed on the window beside her. To anyone watching, she looked like nothing more than a curious baby fascinated by a pretty insect. Agent Chen's radio crackled with increasingly frantic voices. Command. We need authorization for enhanced containment protocols. The situation is beyond standard parameters. No, Zara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. You're not taking my daughter anywhere, and you're not hurting these animals who are just trying to protect her. That's when Dr. Williams's familiar voice came from behind them. Maybe it's time everyone understood what they're really dealing with. They turned to see Ruby's pediatrician standing in the kitchen doorway, having apparently entered through the back door during the commotion. But he wasn't alone. With him was an elderly Native American woman whose presence seemed to command instant respect from everyone in the room. This is Elena Whitefeather, Dr. Williams said quietly. She's been waiting 18 months to meet Ruby. Elena approached slowly, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom. In our tradition, we have stories of children who are born as bridges between the human world and the world of our animal brothers and sisters. We call them spirit speakers. Agent Chen looked skeptical. With all due respect, ma'am, this is a matter of national security, not folklore. Elena smiled gently. Is it? Look outside, Agent Chen. Your weapons are useless. Your authority means nothing. Your helicopters cannot land. A baby has accomplished what no army could do. She has united every living creature in this area under a single purpose. Ruby looked up at Elena and immediately reached out her arms, making the happy sounds she usually reserved for her favorite toys. Elena took her gently, and the moment Ruby settled in her arms, something remarkable happened. Every animal outside went silent. Not the silence of fear, but the peaceful quiet of a crisis resolved. The birds remained in their positions. The mammals stayed alert, but the tension that had been building all morning simply dissolved. The last spirit speaker was born in 1924, Elena continued, gently rocking Ruby. She lived to be 97 years old, spending her life helping resolve conflicts between expanding human settlements and displaced wildlife. She prevented dozens of situations that could have ended in tragedy for both humans and animals. Dr. Williams stepped forward. Ruby's brain scans have shown activity patterns I've never seen before. When Elena contacted me 6 months ago and told me to watch for signs, I thought she was... Well, I thought it was superstition, but the evidence has been building for months. What kind of evidence? Zara asked. The unusual animal behavior you mentioned, Ruby's advanced cognitive responses, most importantly, her ability to remain calm in situations that would terrify most children her age. Spirit speakers aren't just born with the ability to communicate with animals, Zara. They're born with an innate understanding of the natural world that guides their every instinct. Agent Chen was listening intently despite her skepticism. Even if I believed this folklore, it doesn't change the fact that Ruby's abilities could be incredibly valuable for scientific research and conservation efforts. They could, Elena agreed, but only if she chooses to share them freely when she's old enough to make that choice herself. Try to force a spirit speaker to use their gifts against their will, and the connection breaks forever. The animals will no longer trust them, and the gift dies. Ruby made a soft sound and pointed toward the window where the large bear was still standing guard. Elena nodded as if she understood perfectly. She wants to say goodbye to her protectors, Elena translated. She's going to tell them that she's safe now, and they can return to their homes. Zara looked out at the crowd of animals, then at the frustrated government agents, then at her daughter, who was making gentle musical sounds in Elena's arms. For the first time since this incredible day began, she felt a sense of peace. "What happens now?" she asked. Elena smiled. "Now, Ruby grows up as normally as possible, with people who understand her gift and respect it. She learns to control her abilities instead of being controlled by them. And when she's ready, she decides for herself how she wants to use this incredible connection she has with the natural world." Agent Chen started to protest, but Elena held up a hand. "Agent Chen, look outside. Really, look. Do you see any aggression, any threat? These animals aren't here to attack anyone. They're here because a child asked for protection, and they answered her call. What does that tell you about the kind of person Ruby is going to become?" As if responding to Elena's words, Ruby made one final, long, musical sound. The response was immediate and breathtaking. Every bird took flight at once, creating a spiral of wings and color that rose high into the sky before dispersing in all directions. The mammals began moving away in organized groups, not fleeing, but departing with dignity. Even the domestic animals returned to their homes with the satisfied air of a job well done. Within 10 minutes, the yard was empty, except for humans, and the lingering sense of having witnessed something miraculous. The government agents looked around in confusion, their entire operation suddenly pointless without the dramatic animal presence that had made Ruby seem so dangerous. Agent Chen spoke quietly into her radio. "Stand down." "Repeat. All units stand down. Situation is resolved." Dr. Williams checked Ruby over one more time, but she was perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, and perfectly happy to be surrounded by people who loved her. The only sign of her extraordinary morning was the way she kept looking toward the woods with a contented smile, as if she could still sense her animal friends even though they were no longer visible. Elena handed Ruby back to Zara with a gentle smile. "She'll need guidance as she grows, but she won't need protection. Any creature that would harm a spirit speaker would have to answer to every other animal within a 100-mile radius. Ruby is probably the safest child in the world." As the news crews were moved back and the government vehicles began departing, Marcus Reed approached with his phone still recording. "Mrs. Thompson, the whole world is going to want to know what happened here. What should I tell them?" Zara looked down at Ruby, who was babbling happily and playing with her elephant toy as if commanding an army of wildlife was just another part of her normal day. "Tell them," Zara said slowly, "that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places. Tell them that a little girl made friends with a bear cub, and in doing so reminded us all that we share this world with creatures who deserve our respect and protection." She paused, watching as the last of the helicopters disappeared into the distance. "And tell them that the next time someone says it's impossible for humans and animals to understand each other, they should remember the day that an 18-month-old baby proved them wrong. As the crowd finally dispersed and normal life began to return to the quiet neighborhood, Ruby looked up at her mother and spoke her third word, clear and unmistakable: happy. And she was. Happy to be home, happy to be safe, and happy to know that somewhere in the woods nearby, a bear cub was playing with its mother, no longer afraid, no longer lost. The world might never be quite the same after what happened at Rainbow Kids Play Center that day, but for Ruby Thompson, it was exactly as it should be. A place where every living creature could find friendship, understanding, and hope. Years later, when Ruby was old enough to understand the full story of that remarkable day, she would tell people that she didn't remember most of what happened. But she always remembered the feeling of touching the bear cub's nose for the first time, the moment when she realized that the world was full of friends she just hadn't met yet. And every so often, when she walked through the woods behind her house, she would make soft musical sounds and listen for the gentle responses that came back from the creatures who remembered her as the little girl who had once saved a frightened cub, and, in doing so, had saved a little piece of magic in the world. The story of Ruby Thompson became legend, shared around the world as proof that miracles could happen anywhere, anytime, when love and understanding bridged the gaps between different kinds of hearts. But for those who were there that day, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that we are all connected, human and animal, young and old, wild and tame, by invisible threads of compassion that are stronger than any force on earth. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes a baby and a bear cub to help us remember that truth.